Just to let you know that
We're
Linda
recording
joined
now?
us, who's from St. John's in
All right, there
Halifax,
we go.
and she
Welcome,
just wrote
everybody,
about her congregation.
to the
There's been no questions
webinar on
yet.
mission-targeted worship.
And also
Thank you
let me
very much
know
for taking
when
the time
to
to participate
tell
together with me.
people how they could
Let me
download
share a little bit
notes that
about
you've
who
already
I am and
created
what I
for this
do.
evening's
You may or may not
webinar
know
too.
much about me, so just to share a little bit, my name is Tom Bandy. I in the 90s was the National Officer for Congregational Mission and Evangelism for the United Church of Canada. Then called to
And
be
just
more
know that
multinational
as you
and
do that,
writing.
you
And
highlight
the
it, you
last
click Save to My
10 to 12
Computer, it
years,
opens
I
up
have been
another
traveling quite
browser
extensively,
window, which you have
mainly
to
in North
click on
America,
Download to
Canada,
My
the United
Computer,
States,
and then you
Australia,
come
New
back to
Zealand,
this one by looking on your
and
bottom
elsewhere,
tabs for
basically
or
working with
the
churches
Adobe Connect kind of
and
three people around
denominations
the
across the
whiteboard
spectrum of
symbol.
theology and culture and
But
ideology.
we're looking for
So I work
questions
with churches
to
of
be typed in.
all languages and cultures, and small and large and rural and urban, and very liberal and very fundamentalist or conservative. And it's been quite a rewarding thing to do over the last decade or so. I work also for missioninsight.com. It's relevant here because I write all of the commentary for the lifestyle segments that are developed by Experian in North America. And I write commentary about ministry applications to those various lifestyle segments. I will say more about that later on, but it does sort of open up the topic of a new way of planning worship, designing worship, mission-targeted worship. By the way, our webinar is going to be about an hour and a half. I invite you to try to edit or to text in your questions, and there will be intentional breaks as I go along where I'll pause and invite any questions as we go along. So as we begin, I think one of the biggest things I have observed around worship design in the last decade is that there's something new happening in the emergence of postmodernity. And what's new is that if people go to worship at all, if they bother, if they take the time, they're going to worship compelled or propelled or with a sense of urgency. They are going to worship for a particular purpose and for a particular reason. They aren't even church shopping anymore simply to find a worship service that meets their preferences for style of music or technology or whatever. Style is no longer really driving people's choices about worship, but instead seekers are being compelled to worship by deep-seated anxieties about life, about existence, urgently seeking to experience some sort of blessing or some divine grace that will intervene in the midst of that anxiety. And of course they're looking to do it in ways that are very, very accessible and relevant so that they do not have to get through a lot of hoops and hurdles in order to come immediately, you might say, face to face with God incarnate and experience the touch of the holy. This situation in postmodernity is very, very similar, I think, to what we read in Scripture about the origins of ancient Christian worship. For me, as I try to summarize that, ancient Christian worship was an experience of incarnation, the real presence of Jesus Christ, an experience of incarnation that emerged from a spiritual life that was being led 24/7 throughout the week and embedded in one's lifestyle, and in turn would lead to mentoring relationships and mission activity around them. So that worship, ancient Christian worship, was really part of the 7-day-a-week, 24-hour spiritual life, and very much embedded into the calling of all Christians to participate in God's overall plan to redeem the world. Something similar is happening today. People are seeking to experience the fullness of God in the fullness of their lives. This is what I mean, at least when I'm using the word incarnation now. Incarnation happens when the fullness of God and the fullness of life come together, so that the eternal, if you can imagine human beings reaching up with urgency, with desperation, with yearning, with hope. At the same time, God is reaching down. And if you can imagine, in a sense, the fingertips touching, that is the moment, you might say, of incarnation, most perfectly experienced in the person of Jesus Christ. In that sense, eternal hope is meeting existential anxiety, and I'll say more about that in a moment. People seek a practical blessing that is part of their spiritual yearning. God's redemptive purpose is connecting with our demographic context, our life context, and the relevant ways God meets and brings meaning into our life is very much tied to the lifestyle segment in which we live and move in our communities. And I'll try to unpack that as well as we go along. This incarnational moment, though, is what I've come to call the eternal now. It's not my turn. That's a term I borrowed from my mentor, Paul Tillich. But it is that timelessness when one is filled with the extraordinary fullness, or the Greek word of the pleroma of God, to refer to Colossians. The spiritual life leading to the eternal now, leading to mission purpose. The spiritual life is a life led in the ancient tradition. It's a life of movement from humility to conversation to humanity. Those are the key words: humilitas, conversatio, humanitas. In other words, it's radical awe before the Lord, fear of the Lord. It is a conversation with God, with the Spirit, in and through and beyond culture. And it fulfills itself in compassion or humanity or humanitarian behavior, you might say, toward other people around you. It leads, then, the worship experience leads you to participate in missional purpose, and you do that by modeling Christian behavior and the fruits of the Spirit, and you do that by mentoring and being mentored by other Christians, and you do it by equipping one another with whatever skills you need to be a blessing to those around you. So that kind of is the setting in which worship is supposed to happen. It's not just a one day a week. You can't even talk about it as a 7-day. It is a way of life, and that is why in our seminar I keep talking about the way, the worship way. It is the way of life, and the worship service is a central experience and motivator of it. There are a couple of Bible studies which I'll just mention as we go deeper into this webinar. But if you'd like to do some Bible studies with your congregation and encourage people to reflect a little bit about how both Old and New Testament people came to worship, and do so in a way that is countercultural and a critique, you might say, of the way modern churches, Christendom churches, often think of worship, then you would do well by doing a Bible study on these two scriptures. The first one is Micah 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? And Micah talks about how it's not the worship liturgy, it's not the style, it's not the offerings, it's not the incense, it's not anything of that, but what you bring before the Lord is that He requires you to do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. The second scripture that I encourage you to do Bible study around is Acts chapter 18, 5 through 13. This is a critical moment in the mission to the Gentiles. Up until this point, St. Paul has been relying on the synagogue and the synagogue worship as the platform through which he helped people experience the real presence. But at this critical moment, he gets frustrated and literally leaves the synagogue and goes directly next door to the home of a Gentile named Titius Justus. And even some of the leaders of the synagogue follow him there, and there he begins a new, I'll just call it a new kind of indigenous worship. It was controversial, even as worship change is controversial today. Paul was accused of persuading people to worship in ways that are contrary to established tradition, to church polity, to whatever. And the story goes that Paul is encouraged in a dream, saying, Jesus says, do not be afraid, but speak out, for there are many in this city who are my people. And that, for me, that's a great springboard to begin talking about different kinds of worship as they bless different kinds of people in uniquely different ways. And we can design worship in very distinct ways to be a blessing to people in a unique way. And that's why, for Paul, the Gentile mission is summed up in 1 Corinthians 9:22, I've become all things to all people, so that by all means I might rescue some. And that really is the attitude Paul brings to worship as we read through the various epistles and we read some of the ancient texts. We know that people in the ancient world in different places and contexts worshipped actually very differently depending on the demographic, the lifestyle context, the segments, and so on. And really the most important thing was that whatever they did, however they did it, it was an experience of incarnation. Somehow or other, they were experiencing the real presence of Jesus Christ. The only good worship then, as we talk about the 6 ways of worship, I am someone that believes that the only good worship is worship that helps people experience the transforming power of God and motivates them to walk daily with Jesus. That's really it. There's nothing else around liturgy or how you do the order of service in the bulletin or how you set up the chairs or whatever. But that's really it. As long as it helps someone experience the transforming power of God and motivates them into the life of discipleship, that's what worship is supposed to do. Now, I probably raced rather quickly through some of my theological assumptions. I want to talk more about the existential anxieties themselves, which compel people to worship and which form the basis of mission-targeted worship. Before I do that, though, are there questions? Brian, do you see anything that I should be addressing in what's been texted to us so far? Okay. All right. Do people observe where the to the right column in the middle there's mission targeted worship handout, and if you haven't downloaded that, you certainly you'd want to do that and have it with you. Okay. While I'm just waiting another moment, I'll go on in a second. One of the struggles I have with webinars all the time is the pace of my speaking. And if I'm rushing too fast or going too slow, try to text that in or let me know. Whenever you can't actually see people, and you can't tell whether they're yawning or whether they're frantically writing or whatever, it's hard to kind of pace presentation. So do give me any feedback like that you can. I'm going to go on, Brian. So there are basically 6 ways to worship. I am not trying to limit that in any way. I think that there's a huge creativity out there today in worship design. But what I've tried to do in identifying these basic 6 ways of worship is trying to summarize 6 very, very distinct ways I see Christians worshiping today, at least primarily in the West, although I do talk to some people in Eastern Europe and Africa, South Africa as well. I should mention, by the way, that I have worked and consulted with churches and Christians in every state of the United States except Maine and New Hampshire and Hawaii. And I've worked in every province and major city in Canada except Prince Edward Island and Northwest Territories, and every state and major city in Australia and New Zealand. And I do a lot of coaching with European Protestants primarily, mainly in Western Europe, and some conversations with people elsewhere in the world. And I'm just trying to say that to say, as I look at that and try to sift through all of that diversity, there seem to be 6 basic kinds of ways people are approaching worship design today. And that's why I'm want to try to describe each of the 6 different kinds. And this diagram that you're looking at now is also in the handout. There's a parallel for me. There are 6 basic existential anxieties which drive people, that compel people, that worry people, but which bring them to worship. These 6 anxieties may be felt more intensely at one time or another time, but there's a sense in which these are sort of the fundamental anxieties which make humankind restless. Each one is connected with a certain yearning in our lives which drive us to experience Christ in a unique way. So, the first anxiety is the existential anxiety of emptiness. People are yearning, they feel lost, and they are looking to find purpose or direction in their lives, and seek to primarily connect with God in the guise of the spiritual guide. The second anxiety is meaninglessness. People are lonely, looking for relationship, or maybe perhaps better to say rapport, and they are looking for the perfect expression of humanity as an incarnational experience. People are driven by fate, feeling trapped and looking for deliverance, longing to experience, I call it the new being. Again, you see the influence of Paul Tillich on my thinking, but in that term, but that's the higher power, so to speak, that intervenes and makes all things new. People are anxious about death, dying. They're looking for new life, looking for the promise keeper who can give them some assurance or guarantee for the future. People are driven by guilt, broken, physically, relationally, emotionally, looking for healing, longing to experience God as a healer. And people are driven by shame, or the fear of condemnation. They are abused, looking for vindication, looking for God as a justice bringer, or someone who will not just bring justice but lift us from our shame to discover new self-esteem. So those, that's the broad outline of what we're going to be exploring in greater depth here. Please note that there is a direct correlation between the changing circumstances of one's life and the kind of worship one seeks. So what we're seeing more and more is that people are migratory. They will go to one kind of worship service as their life circumstance may change and other anxieties drive them. They will migrate to a different kind of worship service, and that may mean a different church or a different faith community. Because what they're looking for, of course, they're not just trying to be loyal to a tradition, but they want to follow the experience of Christ so that they can be blessed by the touch of the Holy in whatever way they yearn to experience it. Also notice there is a direct correlation between lifestyle segments and the anxieties that motivate those lifestyle segments and the kind of worship they seek. And I want to say a bit more about lifestyle segments now. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the term. There are two major demographic research companies in the world, Experian and Prism. At the moment, I'm operating from Experian, although I coach many Canadian churches around the use of Prism. Whichever one of those you use, there are different levels of magnification of the data. The broadest and biggest is pure demographics. That's segmenting the population simply by age, race, family status, gender, education, occupation, etc. But most nonprofits, corporations, and growing churches no longer use pure demographics, for example age, as a way anymore of trying to define, describe people, or shape ministries to people. For example, we've largely given up age as a good way of describing the diversities of people out there. We have seniors with a mentality of 16-year-olds and 16-year-olds with a mentality of 80-year-olds, and so age is no longer very helpful. So instead, we're looking at lifestyle segments. The next magnification down groups people by their attitudes, behaviors, lifestyle preferences, retail priorities, recreational priorities, personal relationships, their tastes, their habits, political perspectives, outlooks, work ethics, religiosity. All these factors are revealed through how you use your credit cards, how you behave in your daily living, and people will group together who share common worldviews, attitudes, and behavior patterns, and that's a lifestyle segment. Now, today, using Experian, and just looking at the United States, for example, there are 19 lifestyle groups and 71 lifestyle segments. In Canada, if you're using Prism, they're roughly about the same, but a little bit fewer lifestyle segments. And this is important to just recognize that just 10 years ago, there were only 13 lifestyle groups and 47 lifestyle segments. So just in that brief span of time, we've seen the consistent diversification of people. So this is a world in which one size will not fit all, and this is the fundamental reason why blended worship never works. We have tried so hard to please everybody in blending worship, and discovering that at any given time, no one is ever really satisfied with what we're doing. And that's why growing churches are turning away from blending worship to mission targeting worship and developing at least 2 or 3 different kinds of worship even out of the same church. And that's what we're talking about today. These are just some examples of some of the names lifestyle segments are given. There's a whole group called Flourishing Families. Some of those segments are called Generational Soup, Babies and Bliss, Family Funtastic, Asian Achievers. The names give you a little bit, perhaps, of a flavor of just what kind of people are in that group. Young City Solos, Status-Seeking Singles, Urban Edge are some other examples. Struggling Societies, Small Town, Shallow Pockets, Soul Survivors, Hard Times, those are other lifestyle segments. 71 of these very different lifestyle segments. And what we're discovering is that different lifestyle segments tend to connect with 1 or 2 of the 6 different kinds of worship. And so when you do research about your mission field, wherever you are learning who are the lifestyle segments out there and in what proportion are they represented in our community. And this will begin to give you clues as to the kind of worship they're seeking, the kind of incarnational experience they're yearning for, and how you can begin to shape it and design it in order to be a blessing to them. 6 ways to worship. Number 1, this is the first kind of worship. I'm going to walk through this one and then pause see if you have any questions, as I promised. This kind of worship, coaching worship, is on page 2 of your handout, by the way. Coaching worship is probably one of the fastest growing kinds of mission-targeted worship today. It is often associated with churches like the Willow Creek or the Saddleback Valley or those kind of churches. Coaching worship is responding to people who are driven primarily by the existential anxiety of emptiness and their feelings of being lost. They may be suburbanites lost in the suburbs. They may be advancing in their careers and kind of lost their moral compass. But they have a vacuum of meaning in their life. They feel lost, and they are longing to experience God as a spiritual guide through the ambiguities of daily living. Coaching worship is really about a dialogue, a dialogue about lifestyle. That's why we often talk about it as being topical. The lifestyle segments that are attracted to this kind of worship are usually segments whose lives are in transition, or it might be that they're very mobile, they're moving from city to city, or they're moving from relationship to relationship. Often these are people in communities that are dramatically changing, like, for example, in the Toronto area, where there are small towns and villages that in the last 10 years are being overcome by the urban sprawl and the new townhouses and subdivisions and so on. And there's a huge difference between those new lifestyle segments and the ones that have lived in that small town all the time. Coaching worship is, as you can see by the picture there, is usually very informal. People are often sitting around tables rather than pews. There's a great deal of dialogue and mentoring that goes on. The worship is advertised, usually with a marquee out on the side of the road, and basically it's always a how-to topic: how to be a better parent, how to be a better Christian business person. I was in a church in Baltimore not long ago that did this kind of worship, and this happened to be a Assemblies of God church, actually. And his topic was a three sermon, or a three worship series on how Christians fight with each other. That's the topic. So it was how married Christian partners fight with each other, how parents and children who are Christians fight with each other, and I forget what the third one was. But it's very, very practical. Tips on healthy living. Topically guides you through the ambiguities of daily living. Usually there isn't really preaching. Instead of the classic preacher and the sermon, usually you had a guest expert. It might be a Christian social worker or a Christian business person or someone with expertise in that field who was a Christian, and they would simply offer, using scripture and their own faith experience, practical advice on how you deal with whatever the particular ambiguity is you're wrestling with. So in this sort of service, the pastor might be there to lead prayer and to welcome people, but then steps away and you may have a guest speaker, someone who's a credible specialist. These services strive to be very biblically sound. They're utterly reasonable. They make a lot of common sense. They are extremely culture sensitive to the demographics of the people who are there. You can see that in the refreshments they choose to serve and in the kind of music that they might play. And people go there expecting to feel a real sense of the presence of the Holy Spirit, the spirit of the room, being very warm and inviting and very freeing to be in dialogue. So coaching worship really is very simple. In coaching worship, there's music, there's message, and there's next steps. That's it. End of the story. So there may be music before, during, after. the message, a coaching message, might be using PowerPoints, and it might be 30 minutes long. And then at the end of the service, they'll point you in the direction of the small groups and other opportunities to go deeper into the subject, and you'll move on. Very little else. No creeds, no liturgies. The topics are very urgent, very practical. And the three rules of thumb in coaching worship design are: keep it contextual, keep it informal, and keep it simple. I usually see these sorts of services. They're usually late Sunday morning. It's usually the 11 o'clock service, because many of these services aim at youngers who have been partying on Saturday night and they've been sleeping in, or they aim at young families that need more time to get the kids ready to come to church on Sunday morning. So they're usually later on Sunday morning, and often include a lunch, during which there can be further dialogue with the expert who has been talking to them. Sometimes, on rare occasions, I will see them early Sunday morning in some lifestyle segments. I was in Huntsville once, where the aerospace program
there's no
has a lot of
questions
young
here. And what I was
engineers with
wondering,
young
just to make
families.
sure everybody's alive still,
Their worship
is we can
service
have them
called
just change
Cappuccino
their
with
status
Christ
to a check mark so we know
was
that
at
they
7
don't have a
a.m. in the
question
morning,
burning.
and the topic
I'm finding
was,
your
how to,
explanations very
how to help children
and clear. So
overcome experiences of death in the family, or something like that. And it was
I
that
think
early
others
because
are
these
too,
families wanted to
because
walk
I'm
the
noticing
Appalachian Trail later that day, so they
everyone's-
just wanted to move on with their day. You don't follow the Christian year in this worship design, you follow the pagan year, and you often are very responsive to local emergencies. Facilities and technologies, you need terrific child care, infant through toddler, but you can get by with children without a Sunday school, and they can be at the back of the worship center and playing with toys, or just kind of occupying themselves under the watchful eyes of the parents. Very family-friendly environment. I've often been in worship centers where there are diaper change tables in the sanctuary. A lot of multiple choices and refreshments, kind of a smorgasbord.
That are just coming in is
very simple stage,
very
lighting,
clear, no questions, great,
tables with
just
mixed
lots
seating,
to absorb. And
lot
Linda,
of
to
visuals,
change your
surround sound,
status, it's the
and
little
use multiple
person with their hand up
microphones
in the air
because you want to
at
be
the
able
top
to hear
of the
people
screen
in the
with the
dialogue
drop-down
and the
arrow,
Q&A
and you could just choose
as the coaching speaker is speaking.
So
you know this worship service is successful by watching the number of visitors in worship, the number of church leaders interacting with seekers, the number of significant conversations happening during and after worship, and the number of midweek small groups that the worshipers will attend. And those are the statistics that you follow. So coaching worship, experience of Christ, spiritual guide, mentoring, or small group relationships. Any questions about coaching worship? And the Jeopardy theme song music will come back on. Yeah, you can hum it. While you're thinking, let me call your attention to the handout at the bottom of each option of worship. Is a self-assessment tool. That's only there for you to ponder, to assess how much does your current worship service, or one of your worship services, really resemble coaching worship, and what would you do to adjust it and change it. That's what the exercise is really for.
Okay.
Yeah, no one's dropped out yet either. That's good. I'll go on. Second kind of worship is one of two kinds of worship that is often considered traditional worship. When people use the word traditional worship, very often they mean educational worship. This is particularly true among mainstream church people in congregations over 200 people that are fairly well educated, or at least have beyond high school education, and if not liberal arts, but some professional training. Educational worship is usually driven by people who are anxious about meaninglessness. They don't know if they believe in God. They don't know about the authority of the Bible. They don't know about any absolutes anymore in their life. They feel rootless. They feel they're sort of threatened because the myths, you might say, the meaning myths that have supported their life have been crumbling in the postmodern world. And some of that perhaps through the demise of liberal arts education, or the changes being brought by advances, or at least developments in science and technology and so on. These people often also feel very lonely. So educational worship always has a component of passing the peace and of friendship building. Educational worship congregations usually think of themselves as very friendly congregations, or try to be very friendly congregations, because they are trying to help you experience Jesus the Christ as the perfect human, the perfect relationship, the perfect companion, the perfect friend, but perfect in the sense of revealing what really are the absolutes and the best that life has to offer. So the perfect relationship is one that not only befriends you, but it reveals to you the foundational absolutes, or reliable sort of foundational articles of faith and values that will make sense out of your world. Educational worship is really all about exploring God's world and my place in it. Educational worship, usually, as you can see in the picture, is usually in a more formal sanctuary. People tend to sit in rows, pews, or chairs in order to pay attention to the speaker and to what's happening at the front. You'll find that the people who gravitate to educational worship, these are people in lifestyle segments of transitional careers. They're often also people who have been experienced broken relationships. And very often the people that appreciate educational worship are people who have had a liberal arts education, know something about history, philosophy, literature. That's why they appreciate the preacher, the sermon. Will make all those literary allusions and historical connections and so on, because that helps them. So it's those kinds of lifestyle segments. Educational worship is all about truth and authenticity, exploring theological and ethical questions. Often the bulletin is very thick with words, with liturgy, study helps, you might say. It often brings up provocative ideas, gives you insight into the great ethical dilemmas of life, so to speak. This particular image, this picture, I took this picture when I was working with a church in Boston. It's a door of a congregational church, an old Boston common church, and that was the sign, on the front door. You can see, you get a sense, they're trying to connect with lifestyle segments. Near Harvard, they're trying to connect with people for whom an educational worship experience is going to respond to their anxiety about meaninglessness and also give them some sense of companionship and humanity and friendship. The preaching is classic. This is now where a lot of classic Christendom still lives. Usually it's an ordained minister. If that minister has a gown with 3 stripes sewn on the sleeve, all the better. It's an exposition of Scripture. It's an explanation of faith. The pastor is usually ordained, seminary trained. They use a common lectionary, exploring Old and New Testaments. They like to preach in a way which is very, very convincing or persuasive. And they teach principles that are universally applicable. And with a bit of a smile, I just talk about the silver-tongued pastor. I mean, this really is what I was trained to do when I went to seminary. I went to Princeton, and they were kind of training us to be silver-tongued, expositing, preaching, leading an educational worship service. Content, basically the three pieces of the service. What's valuable here is continuity, predictability, and profundity. Continuity with a Christendom traditional denomination, predictability so that no matter wherever you go in the country, you feel right at home, the liturgy is the same, and of course it's very profound. Keep it liturgical, keep it formal, keep it historical if you're going to do this worship. Very often the service is Sunday morning at 9:30, followed by coffee hour. Or occasionally you'll see it at Sunday evening at 7, followed by dessert. At McLean Bible Chapel, for example, they have people sitting at executive desks with electrical outlets for your laptop to plug in, and the wireless, and the teaching educational service. People are expected to take lots of notes, and then they'll have sweets afterward. It follows the Christian year and responds well to ecumenical and interfaith priorities. You have to have a child management strategy there, because you're primarily senior sensitive in an educational service. In other words, people don't like crying children in the sanctuary or toddlers running up and down, and that's why they have the Sunday school often concurrent with the worship service. Usually the refreshments are healthy choices for the seniors. Skip the donuts and go for the vegetables. The sanctuary has the pulpit, the chancel, the pews, the rows, the choir stalls, usually the classic pianos, organs, good acoustics. They may not use any video images. If they are, they're static, but not YouTube. They do like focal points, like stained glass, like Christendom symbols, and so on. And you measure the success of this worship service by counting the number of members and adherents in worship, by the intensity of passing the peace. Usually it takes a long time. People grip your hand real hard. The quality of eye contact between the speaker and the listeners. The number of memorable points that you'll write down and put on the refrigerator when you go home. The number of Sunday school attendees, particularly an adult Sunday school that will meet before or after on Sunday morning. And the number of midweek Bible studies, not just any small group, but Bible studies or book clubs or book
Linda made her
discussion
comment
groups or
just before you
theological
began,
discussion groups, and so on.
at the bottom of those comments.
So educational worship introduces you to Christ,
two examples she gave us.
the perfect human, the teacher, the truth giver. And I'll just comment, and then as we go now to see if there are any questions, and comment that this form of worship is losing strength. Fewer and fewer lifestyle segments are interested in this kind of worship service, which, to be candid, is one of the reasons that I think that some denominational traditions that have relied on this are struggling the most in the postmodern world. Brian, are there any questions? You want to whistle again? All right. Well, okay. Well, while you're all thinking, I'll do a commercial. My newest book is called Really Relevant and Always Faithful, available on Amazon.com. This is the book that explains the 6 kinds of worship as they are applied to understanding lifestyle segments. It's my filter overall of how to interpret lifestyle segments and apply ministry to them. So if you want to look more up on these 6 kinds of worship, that's the book. Really Relevant and Always Faithful, How Churches and Ministries Target Mission in an Explosion of Diversity. Amazon.com. Okay. Right, okay.
Okay. And just to note, there's a little less than a half an hour left. So.
Well, I will go on. Well, Sharon's typing. Maybe I'll wait just a quick second and then I'll go on. More than one person typing. I find while you're typing that I do a lot of coaching for pastors under stress, and one of the great stressors for pastors is that they know educational worship is not working well for them anymore for ministry, and they want to shift to coaching worship. They definitely want to shift over to that coaching kind of worship, but they don't really know how. It is an entirely different way of speaking publicly. Is a very different way of designing worship, and so it takes a lot of work and extra coaching to make the transition. Yeah, Sharon, I will be getting to this, but the fastest growing 2 worship options today are coaching worship, which I just talked about, and transformational worship, which is going to come up next. Well, I'll carry on then. The next kind of worship, Sharon, is transformational worship. Transformational worship is probably not just one of the fastest growing worship options in the world today, but transformational worship is probably one of the scariest kinds of worship for many of traditional mainstream church people. And yet many of their children are gravitating to this kind of worship service. People are driven to transformational worship because they feel the anxiety of fate, they feel trapped, they feel overwhelmed, they feel like they're in jail, they feel like they're, and this is why transformational worship works well with addictions. One form of it is recovery worship. Another form of it is Pentecostal type worship. It is worship that can be done, this kind of worship can be done in any number of ways. I've seen it done with lots of smoke and incense and Gregorian chant, in an Orthodox cathedral, and I've seen it done at the Airport Blessing in Toronto, where there's just a big hall and a lot of pillows on the floor to catch them when they fall. It's very emotional, and people really are looking to experience Jesus Christ as a higher power who's going to intervene to break your addiction, or experience Christ as the new being who's going to literally give you a fresh start and make everything new. A real kind of a born again kind of experience. Transformational means that it's almost magically you're turned from a frog into a prince, or you turn around your life, you get a fresh start, you recover from your addiction. This is why many of the people that gravitate to this kind of worship, some of them are people who are experiencing grinding poverty, or others who are not poor. They may be rich, but they may be experiencing a lifeless routine, inescapable circumstances in their lives. And for many, They're gravitating to this kind of worship because they are addicted to self-defeating habits that they chronically deny and they cannot escape, and they're looking for the intervention of the higher power. Addiction being one of the number one health issues in North America and the world today. It's interesting note, by the way, that addiction, the two countries that have the highest addiction rates today are the United States and Brazil. And these are both countries that are beginning to heavily gravitate so many people toward some form of Pentecostal or addiction recovery or other kind of transformational worship. So there we are. That sign, by the way, is one I just took a while back here in New Orleans from a billboard. This kind of worship is very powerful around this area. In transformational worship, usually it is a lay preacher who speaks. It may not be an ordained person. Lay testimony or lay witness of someone who will share their life struggle and spiritual victory is often crucial. It is very invitational, whether you come forward for healing prayer, or whether you come forward for an altar call, or whether you come forward for a baptism or whatever. You're being invited to surrender your life and be born again. There's a lot of biblical assurances. There's a real sense of life and lifestyle surrender. It usually has a very strong sense of small group, personal support, peer group support during worship as well as beyond the worship service, which is why you'll often see in transformational worship another layer of lay leader. These are the personal counselors or caregivers who lurk around the worship center, ready to go to people who are in tears or who have fallen down or literally collapsed, and support them, be with them, lift them up, pray with them, etc. Often there are a lot of dramatic things happening, dramatic actions happening. So this is about recovery, it's about liberation, about new direction, about inner peace. So the rule of thumb is keep it personal, or be personal, prayerful, and powerful. It's very, very intimate, very personal. Prayer is often spontaneous, but it can also be liturgical and ancient. But it always is very emotive, very powerful. Keep it awesome, keep it relational, and above all, keep it non-judgmental. Absolutely no hint of judgmental. This is why, for example, most Southern Baptists I meet are really, really, really having a hard time with transformational worship because it's just too radically accepting in many ways. Usually see these worship services on weekday evenings, maybe at 8 o'clock with constant coffee before, during, and after. People are they'll go out, bring their coffee back in. You sometimes see them Sunday evenings at 7, followed by breakout groups that might be recovery groups. They tend to they don't follow a lectionary or the pagan year. They follow kind of a 12-step process routinely to kind of track the vicious cycle of addiction. They're very responsive to people who are in personal despair. What kind of facility here? You rarely do these in a churchy building, an ecclesiastical looking building. You're usually in a place where there's no frills, and you have an ultra contemporary sound, very basic refreshments, and takeout. Takeout means that you take the refreshments and put them in bags and have them ready for people to take with them when they go out. For many of them on hard times, that may be their supper when they go home. Very dramatic impact, so that often means that there are spotlights and microphones, a lot of open space. Remove as much hardwood as possible so if somebody's slain in the spirit, they won't knock themselves out. Variable lighting sometimes to dim the lights or colored lights. You'll often see bands, amplified bands, providing music, and the music is often very rhythmic. There's a United Methodist Church in Memphis I've been involved with. They actually They actually honored me by naming their church plant after my book, Kicking Habits. They're now about 500 people. It's one of the few services I've seen which is completely and absolutely really hard rock worship service with a lay witness and invitations, and they've got recovery groups coming out the walls. A lot of video image, a lot of sensory inputs. You overload the senses in that kind of a worship service. Now, you measure success. You know, are we successful in transformational worship? Well, you count the number of lives transformed, the number of stories from the mission field, whether or not you're recognized by cross-sector mission partners like the emergency room hospital. You measure the percentage of worshipers in midweek recovery, the number of visitors accompanied by members, the number of adult baptisms, and the intensity of expectation in the room. It's totally unpredictable. People really they come not quite sure what God's going to do that day. So transforming worship, experience Christ to give you a fresh start. And we'll pause another minute. Okay. Well, that's interesting, Linda. Good for you, first of all, to recognize yourself in the second example. Good for you that you're you're practicing a very different kind of worship. I'm not sure which one you are identifying it with. Maybe you'll tell me a little later on. And I see what you're doing. You try it once a month. You don't have to do it, full out every Sunday.
Everyone's
or every
waiting
week.
in anticipation.
You try it once a month.
The sixth one.
The issue of you say it has met with much appreciation, but attendance is not different either in numbers or types of person. This takes some evaluation. There are two things I'd mention. One is you need to do some evaluation. Go through what I just said earlier about the characteristics, the measuring sticks, and what do you measure to see if it's successful. And because often old habits get in the way and we're not measuring the right things, and we can tweak it and perfect it. It usually takes at least 9 months, and in your case, since it's monthly, it'll take 2 years, to be honest, often to establish credibility. Because you're reaching different lifestyle segments, many of which are very skeptical of the church. It's a bait and switch that we're going to get you in here and then we're going to haul you into the traditional service, something like that. So it often takes a lot of time and persistence, and you want to really work on advertising and reaching people not currently involved in your church or your other worship service. But good for you for experimenting with it. Good for you for not trying to just blend worship and please everybody. You're entering the adventure of multi-tracking worship, and it'll be a bit stressful, but it can also be fun, and certainly I'll say very rewarding. Personally, often a pastor says they've often never felt so close to Christ and so renewed themselves in ministry as when they try to do a new worship. I'm going to preach, and I don't want to do that right now. I guess I'm going to keep going. Number 4. This is inspirational worship. Inspirational worship is often a pretty common kind of worship. It connects with people, especially who are very anxious about death and dying. This is why you see a lot of inspirational worship may have older or fragile people in the worship service, often reaching people who feel hopeless about their circumstance, about their health, about any number of things. And inspirational worship is intended to help them meet Christ, who reassures and promises and keeps promises for new life and for the future. Inspirational worship, this is a photograph of the inside of the Orthodox Church in San Francisco, where I was doing some work with them. And you just feel the confidence for eternity and the strength for tomorrow that you get, and their worship really is extraordinarily uplifting and inspirational. It is designed, like all inspirational worship, so that people will leave, walking 5 inches above the ground. Now, you can do it with Handel's Messiah, and you can do it with Celine Dion and Dry Ice blowing across the stage. There are any number of ways you can do inspirational. But the ones who are going to connect with it tend to have health issues. They tend to be aging, or any age group feeling unsafe or at risk. They're looking to find strength for tomorrow. They're looking to celebrate God's blessings. This is why often these are called celebration worship services. They want to have renewed confidence that life is good. The preaching here is not informational. You don't write down a lot of points, but it is highly motivational. Many of the great African American preachers that I've met are like this. You're enthralled with what they're saying and the stories that they are telling, and then you realize you hadn't taken a note. You really, there's not one thing you write down. Often the speaker is a survivor, someone who's graduated from the School of Hard Knocks. They rely on a lot of Bible stories. They tell very impressive personal experiences. They're very transparent about their own personal history and biography. And often the presentation is very, very emotional. Content is celebrative, attractional, provides a lot of insight, illumination. You're really flying high. It's often original, unpredictable, and non-stop engagement. There's no dead air. There's no silent space. Inspirational worship, because of that, is sometimes criticized as being entertainment, but it is not. It is simply heartfelt and gut level and experiential, which a lot of entertainment can be too. But it has a particular purpose to reassure people about life. Usually they're Sunday morning. Often this is the one worship service, the only worship service of the church. Maybe it's to 10:30 with coffee. Sometimes it's Saturday evening at 6 with great dessert. There's often themes related to Christian living that they use to preach on. They often respond to community crises and big global challenges. If you want to do this worship, you've got to have a great nursery, and then you've got to have a big sound. Great acoustics, big choir, big band.
Correct. You're right on time. 10 minutes.
A lot of bass, a lot of rhythm. You only need basic refreshments. Spotlight, microphone, flexible seating, bands, amplifiers, sensory inputs. You measure success by the size and intensity of interaction, the visibility and diversity of emotion, the power and commitment to singing. Singing, this is where people come away. The sound. That's why they might like to sing praise choruses or familiar hymns or whatever, because they want that overwhelming sound, the joy of putting voice to their faith. You measure the number of repeatable stories that people remember, the number of second and third time visitors. What I call the buzz and bump in the community. The buzz and bump means that there's a buzz. People out there in the neighborhoods in the community are talking to each other, saying, "Do you know what's going on over there?" The people are talking about what that's like. I've known people to measure success by actually putting an usher outside after worship with a clicker and just counting the number of people leaving with a smile. So inspirational worship, meeting Jesus, the promise keeper, to give you a hopeful attitude. Pause. I won't do a very long pause because I know that we got to keep moving. Fifth kind of worship is healing worship. This is also a growing edge in worship choices today, just simply because of the brokenness that so many people are feeling. But behind that brokenness is usually feelings of guilt or inadequacy of some kind. that has led to the broken marriage, the broken relationship, the broken parenting, something like that. And this clearly is intended to introduce you to Jesus Christ, the healer. These worship services are often called caregiving worship as well, and this is where we find a lot of mainstream so-called traditional churches that think of themselves as a family. Healing or caregiving worship is particularly popular in faith communities with less than 100 people, particularly in aging small towns or transitioning urban neighborhoods. These are connecting with people who are broken, often with aging baby boomers, to be honest. People my age. Love the kind of they love this. They're like, I want to be in a small setting, a small church. Everybody knows each other. There's all kinds of things going on. The announcements take 20 minutes. Passing the peace takes 30 minutes. I mean, it's overwhelmingly kind of caregiving and friendly. And you'll see singles and couples and so on. Meditative, quiet, sacramental often. Renews, restores, gives you inner peace. In this kind of worship service, there are long moments of silence. Taizé worship can be sort of like this sometimes. Long moments of silence where people kind of collect their thoughts and find serenity in their hearts and so on. Often it is expressed as traditional intercessory pastoral worship, and it gives you a sense of belonging and harmony. It really enfolds you in God's love. The pastor is the front and center in this worship service. Very often wearing cassock alb or gowned. The pastoral presence means that this is often someone who exercises priestly humility, someone who's seen as a kind of mediator to God, a great prayer, a great intercessory prayer leader. Really emphasizes Jesus' attitude of inclusiveness to everybody. They usually talk a lot about inclusiveness. Very transparent to the Spirit, a lot of compassion, a lot of symbolic acts. I had an image earlier about the children's hands in the baptismal font. That was taken from a United Church of Canada congregation in a small town. Symbolic acts like candle lighting and other things in addition to the sacraments. Well, as I say, in the content of the service, a lot of pregnant silence, very familiar family feeling. People think of the service as an oasis. It's family, friendly, and familiar. So keep it personal, keep it in the family, and keep it generationally diverse. It's usually Sunday morning. Often it's at 9 without music and repeated exactly the same at 11 with more music. They usually observe the major holidays. Including Christmas Eve, Easter, Thanksgiving, and Halloween. And they respond very heavily to the life cycle changes. They're always announcing when someone's had an anniversary or that kind of thing, birthday. Such worship is usually in an ecclesiastical-looking building. There are a lot of denominational signs and
Christine
colors
put up
floating around.
That comment,
Basic
and so is
refreshments,
Sharon.
Big steel urns with basic coffee and tea,
And,
bulk food from the or
so
a lot of potluck
Christine's was
suppers.
about
There's the altar, pulpit, choir, a lot of doctrinal symbols at hand. There's always a very intentional desire to be handicapped accessible. Usually it's very simple audio sounds and no video, because people think of video screens as just a distraction. They don't like them in the sanctuary. And you measure success by membership, generational participation, feeling of harmony. You always count the number of personal healings, and you count the number of stories about balanced living. And they have a reputation for real friendliness, acceptance, and very loyal to the rites and routines of the denomination. So caregiving worship or healing worship introduces you to Jesus the healer, helps you have a healthy, balanced life. I will keep going. So, number 6. This is the least common worship service in North America, but it is more common outside of North America and increasingly common in some areas in North America, particularly in urbanizing areas where there are a lot of singles, childless couples, dual generation incomes, upwardly mobile Gen X, Gen Y. In those kind of demographics, you'll see this kind of worship emerging more and more. It really is feeding people's anxiety about shame or condemnation, and reaching people who feel in some way abused, taken advantage of, abused by the system, or literally physically or emotionally abused. And people are really seeking to experience the justice bringer, the vindicator. Not just someone that can bring a just society, but who can restore my sense of self-worth and sense of self-esteem. So it's really about, here I am, Lord, I need,
And Susan just put up a
I
statement
need
there.
your reach. You see a lot of minorities and recent
they're
immigrants
doing.
connecting with this sort of service, economically disadvantaged, people at risk for victimization. This is a worship service I participated in a park in San Francisco a while back, and you see what they're getting at: your relationship with Jesus, not religion. It was all about witness, about outreach. In this service, they consecrated missionaries. They prayed for missions and missionaries. They were giving thanksgiving for their participation in hands-on mission. Everyone in the group was doing something of practical benefit in their neighborhoods or to in social action. But the social action, they also witnessed to their faith. Usually the leader of this kind of worship service is maybe a missionary or maybe a nonprofit leader, a Christian who is a nonprofit leader. Here in New Orleans, a good friend of mine is the CEO of Project Homecoming, which is
Sharon's been typing,
a house
but I haven't seen
building
something
for
appear. There we go. Any
they
quick
build houses.
tips on how to
It's a
determine the
Christian
unreached
organization.
existential angst
And
in
that's the
small
kind of
town
leader
setting?
of this sort of service. They do often rely on a variety of sacred writings, not just the Bible. They often reference current events, not historical. They are often very outspoken, very critical, very countercultural, often networked with parachurch organizations and other nonprofits. It's all about mission. They pray for and with teams around the world. They consecrate missionaries, send them, support them, spotlight them. It's got to be relevant, networked, and teamed. So you keep it focused outward, you keep it sensitive to strangers, and you very much keep it culturally diverse. Cultural diversity, it doesn't happen unless you've got true racial, language, country of origin, etc. kind of diversity going. These congregations are often very diverse and very young. They may meet weekday evenings at 7 with ethnic foods, Sunday evening but always with excellent internet. They follow the global trends. They respond to community crises.
And
They're often in buildings
Sharon's
with
thinking.
very utilitarian architectures, but they're all wireless with a huge internet bandwidth.
Yeah, so I want to, on
Because
behalf
they
of
like to
Edge
go
and
real
all who
time
attended
with
today,
their
thank
missionary
you
teams
for
in the
this important
Philippines or wherever
discussion
they
on
are.
6
And
ways
despite
to
the
worship.
time change, they want to be
And I
real
also
time and
want
pray
to let
right
the
there with
participants
them
know
while they
that
watch
the
them.
recording of
In
this
these
webinar,
in these worship centers,
especially
you
to
may
pick up
have
parts where they might not have
half a
heard you as
dozen
clearly because I did,
screens,
so that
video
means the
screens
recording
going
will be
at any
fine.
given time. Each one of them
Will be
tuned into
uploaded
something
hopefully in the
different
next week.
on the internet
And
or
there's
CNN
many
or
more webinars to
BBC
choose
or
from,
whatever.
including one next
A lot of
next
interactive
Wednesday in the
software, very
afternoon,
environmentally friendly. They're very
talking about the M
self-conscious about the
word,
environment.
which seems appropriate
Worship
for
tends to be a
Halloween
bit
when we're
messy and
asking for lots of
chaotic.
treats. And
in these services.
again, appreciation is
for
being
success,
shared
you
there by
measure the number of
participants.
missionaries
So please
supported,
watch that. And we
the
also
number of
invite
teams
everybody
deployed from the
to
worship
jump on
service
that
in
link
mission,
for the feedback
the
form
number of lay leaders who
underneath
have
the
hands
notes
laid
there
on
at
them
the
and are
top,
commissioned in the mission.
the right-hand side of your screen.
You measure the size of the mission
All
field. They
feedback
often,
is helpful.
these churches often
for
talk
how we
about city
organize these
reaching,
webinars.
or global reach. Or I remember earlier I said that with caregiving worship, everybody wanted to lead a